15 years ago, I stood in the crowd at his graduation, still wearing my greasy diner uniform, tears in my eyes, watching my son walk across that stage. He found me in the audience and mouthed something I held on to for years. "Thank you, Mom." I believed him when he said he'd take care of me someday. But tonight, I sit alone in a cold cabin he threw me into like trash, while his mother-in-law lives in a ranch bigger than my dreams ever dared to be. I thought raising him alone was the hardest thing I'd ever face. I was wrong. Stay with me till the very end and let me know where you're watching from, so I can see how far the truth really spreads. I'm Eleanor Harris. I'm 68 years old, and tonight I'm sitting alone in this drafty old cabin, staring at the black sky through the kitchen window while my phone lights up and rattles against the table. It's been buzzing every few minutes for hours now, and I've stopped even checking the screen. I know it's Brian, my son. He's already called over 40 times tonight, and he's probably not done. He's scared, though. He'd never say it that way. He's scared because he knows I found out what he's been hiding. All the years of pretending, all the sweet smiles at holidays, the stiff little hugs when he bothered to show up at all, they don't mean a thing anymore. I know who he really is now. He knows I know, and that's why he won't stop calling. But for 15 years, when I was the one begging him for just a little help paying the electric bill, he didn't care if I froze through the winter. He didn't care if I skipped dinners to keep up with the rent. My comfort, my dignity, none of it ever seemed to matter to him. Do you want to hear how my millionaire son betrayed me, how he looked his mother in the eyes, for years knowing what he'd done and never once showed an ounce of shame? Stay here until the end and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far my story travels. Because if there's anything I've learned in the past few weeks, it's that I've been quiet for far too long. People need to hear this. I raised Brian on my own from the time he was a baby. His father died too young and left us with nothing but a little house in Texas and some debts I worked years to pay off. I thought raising him alone would be the hardest thing I'd ever face. I was wrong. That boy, my boy, grew into a man I barely recognize anymore. I sit here tonight, looking out at the dark backyard, the pine trees swaying in the wind, and I wonder what I did wrong. I wonder how I worked myself half to death just to give him everything he needed, only for him to grow up thinking it was okay to take everything from me. My hands are trembling as I reach for the phone again and see it buzzing with his name one more time. Brian. He still hasn't stopped. He can't, because the truth is out now, and there's no going back. When you spend your life thinking of someone as your baby, you never imagine they're capable of hurting you this way. But they are. And when you finally see it for what it is, it changes everything. Tonight, I'm not the woman I was last week, or last year, or 15 years ago. So if you've ever felt like you've been used, like you've been treated like you didn't matter, stay with me. Listen to what I have to say, because my story is about what happens when a mother finally stops forgiving and starts fighting back. I still remember the little house in Waco where Brian grew up. It was nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms and a sagging porch out front, but I kept it as neat as I could. I worked 3 jobs most of those years to keep that roof over our heads. I'd wake up before sunrise to clean offices downtown, then go straight to the diner for my morning shift. At night, I'd stock shelves at the grocery store. I don't even know how I stayed on my feet some days. But I'd come home to find Brian waiting at the window, waving at me like I was the best part of his whole day, and somehow it made everything worth it. I skipped more meals than I can count, so he'd never have to feel ashamed in front of the other kids. I still remember the day he came home crying because the boys at school made fun of his worn-out sneakers. That weekend, I pawned my wedding ring so I could buy him a brand new pair. He was so proud of those shoes, running around the yard and showing them off like they were gold. When he got older, Brian started talking about college, about leaving our little town and making something of himself. He was always bright, always hungry for more. So when he got into that big university in Austin, I didn't even think twice. I went down to the bank and signed over a second mortgage on the house to cover his tuition. I told him not to worry about the money, even though it kept me awake at night wondering how I'd ever pay it back. I was there the day he graduated. I'll never forget the way he looked standing on that stage in his cap and gown, smiling like the whole world was his. He found me in the crowd after and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. He looked me right in the eyes and said he'd take care of me now. That all the years I'd spent breaking my back so he could have a better life hadn't been for nothing. For a long time, I believed him. I believed that all those nights I worked till my hands ached, and all those meals I skipped so he could have just a little more would come back to me somehow. That when he made it big, he'd remember who put him there. But sitting here in this cold little cabin staring at my phone as he keeps calling, I can't help but feel foolish. Those promises he made feel like a cruel joke now. Like they were just words he said in the moment to make me feel better, never meaning to keep them. The boy I raised was grateful, kind-hearted, full of dreams. But somewhere along the way, he turned into a man I don't even recognize anymore. A man who could look at his own mother struggling and turn away without a second thought. It's hard not to wonder if I made some mistake back then. If I gave him too much, made it too easy for him to take me for granted. If all those sacrifices taught him he was entitled to everything, even if it cost me everything. I close my eyes and picture him at 8 years old sitting at the kitchen table with his homework spread out and his tongue stuck between his teeth in concentration. I see him at 16 beaming as he held up his driver's license for me to see. I see him at 22 waving to me from that stage like I was his whole world. Then I open my eyes and look around this little cabin and feel the ache of what's been lost. Not just the money, not just the security, but the trust, the love I thought would never change. It hurts more than anything I've ever felt. I gave him everything I had to give, and in the end he gave me nothing but silence and shame, and a cabin that feels more like a prison than a gift. It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruelest part. It was a slow chipping away, little by little, until I hardly recognized the way he looked at me anymore. The first year he forgot my birthday, I told myself he was busy. He called me a few days later and said work was crazy, and I believed him. But then it happened again the next year and the year after that until even a text message felt like too much effort. I'd see him posting photos on Facebook of his wife Rachel and her mother Sandra, all smiles in front of a sprawling new ranch he'd bought them. It was more house than I could even imagine with white fences and a wraparound porch and stables full of horses. The caption said it was a gift to show how much he appreciated everything Sandra had done for his family. I stared at those pictures for hours, trying to understand what Sandra had done that was worth a $300,000 ranch. I couldn't even get him to call me back most days. I couldn't get him to remember my birthday or pick up when I called just to say I missed him. And then came my 68th birthday. He didn't show up to dinner. Didn't even call. That night, there was a knock at my door, and there he stood holding out a set of keys and a note scribbled on a torn piece of paper. Sorry, Mom. Busy. Hope you like it. Brian. He didn't even come in. Just pressed the keys into my hand and walked back to his car like he couldn't get away fast enough. I stood in the doorway clutching that paper and those keys like a fool trying to tell myself it was something. At least he remembered. At least he gave me something. But when I drove out to see what he'd given me, the truth sank in like a stone. It was a cabin. A tiny $30,000 cabin out in the woods that smelled of fresh paint and cheap air freshener. It felt less like a gift and more like a way to move me somewhere he wouldn't have to think about me anymore. The walls were bare and cold. The yard was overgrown. The furniture was the cheapest kind you could buy in a set. I sat down in the little armchair by the window and told myself not to cry. But I couldn't help it. It wasn't just the cabin. It was everything. The way his wife called me needy behind my back. The way they'd roll their eyes when I asked for help paying my electric bill. The way he acted like every dollar he handed me was some huge favor instead of the bare minimum of what a son owes his mother. I raised him by myself. I gave him every good thing he has in this world. And now he treated me like a burden he couldn't wait to offload. Like something to hide away. I thought about that ranch again. How he'd smiled in those photos, his arm around Sandra like she was the mother he always wanted. How he'd spent an entire weekend helping her move and throwing a party making sure she felt loved. Meanwhile, I got keys shoved in my hand like I was nothing more than a problem he needed to solve. I was his mother. And he couldn't even bring himself to say happy birthday to my face. Every time I called, I felt like I was bothering him. Every time I texted, the silence on the other end made me feel smaller. The boy who used to look at me like I was his whole world now barely looked at me at all. And sitting there in that cabin, staring at the walls, I felt humiliated, discarded. Like all I'd ever done for him didn't matter one bit anymore. Like somehow I'd become disposable to my own son. Those were the little wounds. The ones that piled up until you couldn't pretend not to feel them anymore. Until you couldn't ignore the truth staring you in the face. I wasn't his family anymore. I was just another obligation he couldn't wait to get rid of. And for the first time, I started to wonder just how long he'd been planning to push me out of his life. That night, the cabin felt colder than usual. I couldn't sleep no matter how many blankets I wrapped around myself, so I wandered the little rooms, my mind churning. The shadows stretched long across the floor as I ended up in the bedroom, staring at the narrow closet tucked in the corner. Something about it caught my eye. The back wall didn't look quite right, like it was set in deeper than it should have been. I pressed my hand against the wood and felt a faint give just enough to make my heart skip. I dug my fingers into the edge and pulled. The panel came loose with a groan, revealing a hidden compartment barely big enough to fit a box. It was dusty, but there it sat, an old cardboard box marked with my late husband's handwriting. The words were simple. For Eleanor. Life insurance. My knees went weak as I lifted it out. The weight of it in my hands felt heavier than anything I'd carried in years. I sat down on the bed and peeled back the lid, my breath catching in my throat. The first paper was a life insurance policy worth $500,000 with my name printed clearly at the top as the beneficiary. My fingers trembled as I flipped through payment records showing Robert had kept it up to date until the day he died. My eyes stung with tears I didn't even feel falling. Brian had told me there was nothing. He said Robert had let the policy lapse and there was no money. I'd believed him. All those years I struggled just to keep the lights on. I believed him. Then I found the letters. A series of them from the insurance company dated weeks after Robert's funeral. Each one addressed to Brian, thanking him for providing the necessary authorization to transfer the funds. I froze as I read the words. The signature on the authorization form matched mine almost perfectly. But it wasn't mine. My stomach twisted as realization set in. Brian had forged my name. He'd stolen every penny of what Robert left me, and he'd been living off it for 15 years while letting me grovel for scraps. I sat there clutching the papers, my chest so tight I couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in around me. My son hadn't just forgotten me. He hadn't just abandoned me. He'd betrayed me in a way I could never have imagined. I thought back to all the times I'd thanked him for helping me with bills, all the times I'd apologized for needing him. And all along, he'd been stealing from me, smiling to my face while keeping the truth buried in a closet. It was like my entire world cracked open in that moment. Everything I thought I knew about my son, everything I thought we shared shattered into something sharp and cruel. And sitting there in the darkness, clutching the proof in my hands, I finally saw him for what he really was. I sat at the library computer with the folder of documents still clutched under my arm. My hands shook as I typed in the old email address Robert had once set up for me. I didn't know what I expected to find, but some instinct told me there was more to this than forged papers. The inbox was almost empty, nothing but junk mail and password resets. But then I checked the archived folders and saw dozens of forwarded statements, financial notices, all routed straight to Brian. I scrolled further, digging into the sent folder, and that's when I found it. A thread between Brian and Rachel titled simply Mom. The first message was Brian explaining how much money was left in what he called her trust. He told Rachel he'd moved more funds to cover her mother's ranch. Then Rachel's reply, sharp and cruel, burned itself into my mind. Why do we keep pretending she needs help? She's pathetic. She's been nothing but dead weight since Robert died. I froze. Dead weight. My chest tightened as I kept reading. Rachel said it was embarrassing how I still sent birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside for their kids. She said they threw them away before the children could see, so they wouldn't grow up thinking poverty was normal. Brian's reply cut even deeper. Good call. The last thing we need is them getting too attached to her. She's not part of this family anymore. I sat there, my hands gripping the mouse so tight my knuckles turned white. My breath came in shallow little gasps, but I couldn't stop. The emails went on. Them mocking me every time I called to ask for help. Brian writing that I was manipulative, always looking for sympathy. Rachel calling me clingy and saying it was time to push me further away. Then there was the one where Brian said he wanted to limit visits to holidays only. He wrote that if they kept their distance, the kids would eventually forget about me. Rachel's response was chilling in its simplicity. Smart. Let her fade into the background. She's already halfway gone. My stomach turned. These two people, my own son and the woman he married, had been teaching their children to forget me, to look down on me, to see me as nothing but a nuisance to be hidden away. Every memory I had of Brian as a boy, every sleepless night I'd spent working to give him a better life, every proud tear I'd shed watching him succeed, all of it curdled into something dark and hollow. I stared at the screen through a haze of grief and fury. This was my son. This was who he really was. The boy I raised with love and sacrifice had grown into a man who thought of me as nothing but dead weight. And sitting there in that quiet library, I felt something in me harden. Whatever illusion of family I'd been clinging to all these years was gone. Whatever part of me still believed in him died right there in front of that screen. The next morning, I drove into town and walked into the quiet little office of an attorney I'd found online the night before. Her name was Margaret Porter, and she specialized in elder abuse cases. She listened without interruption as I laid out everything I'd discovered, from the forged documents to the emails where they called me dead weight. When I finished, she nodded slowly and said we had more than enough for both criminal and civil action. We drafted the complaints together that afternoon, her calm assurance giving me a kind of quiet power I hadn't felt in years. As I signed my name to the papers, my hands no longer trembled. A few days later, the phone call started. Brian's name flashing over and over on my screen, voicemail after voicemail, asking me to talk before things went too far. I didn't answer. When he finally showed up at the cabin, he wasn't alone. He brought his attorney, a slick man in a tailored suit, and Rachel, who stood in the doorway clutching her expensive purse and shooting me tight little smiles that didn't reach her eyes. The lawyer tried to charm me with talk of family misunderstandings and how stressful grief can cloud decisions. Brian stood behind him, pale and jumpy, nodding along to every word. When the lawyer got to the part about their offer, 50% of the money, in exchange for me signing a non-disclosure and dropping everything, Rachel finally spoke up. She said it was more than fair. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at Brian and let the silence stretch until his eyes finally met mine. Then I spoke the words I'd been holding in since the day I found that hidden box. The boy I raised died a long time ago. You're just a thief wearing his face. The color drained from his cheeks as Rachel let out a sharp little gasp. Without another word, I walked to the door and held it open. The lawyer started to protest, but I cut him off with a single glance. One by one, they filed out Brian, the last to go, his shoulders slumped and his eyes hollow. He turned back at the threshold like he wanted to say something, but I shut the door behind him before he could. I leaned against the wood for a moment, letting the quiet settle back around me. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Cold, proud, and stronger than they had ever believed I could be. The court moved quickly once the evidence was presented. Brian had no defense strong enough to explain away the forged documents, the stolen funds, or the years of deceit. The judge ordered full restitution with interest and handed down a 2-year prison sentence for financial elder abuse and fraud. The local newspaper ran the story on its front page. A photo of Brian in a suit leaving the courthouse, head down, under the headline, "Millionaire Son Exploits Own Mother." Neighbors who once bragged about knowing him now shook their heads in disgust. Rachel filed for divorce within weeks of the verdict, packing up the children and moving out of state. The house was sold at auction. The luxury cars repossessed, the private school tuition unpaid. The life they had built on my stolen money crumbled just as easily as they'd thought to discard me. I read every article that came out about him, each one another quiet victory. The world finally saw him for who he really was. And for the first time in 15 years, he couldn't hide behind polite smiles and empty words. It didn't bring back the years he took from me, but it gave me something else. A sense of justice. A sense that the truth had finally caught up to him and stripped away the illusion he worked so hard to maintain. I heard later that his first days in prison were rough. No one there cared who he used to be or how much money he once had. In the end, Brian became just another inmate with nothing left but the consequences of his own choices. And that was exactly what he deserved. After the settlement, I bought myself a little ranch on the outskirts of hill country, the kind of place I used to drive by and dream about when life felt too heavy. The house is modest but warm, with a wraparound porch and a view of rolling fields that turn gold at sunset. Every morning, I wake up with a quiet sense of gratitude, knowing that for the first time in decades, this life is mine and no one else's. I planted a garden out back, just like Robert and I used to talk about. Rows of tomatoes, herbs, and wildflowers bloom under my care. I've even started keeping a few hens, and hearing their soft clucks in the morning makes the place feel alive. I signed up for an art class at the community college and joined a little book club that meets at the library every month. Slowly, I've built a circle of friends who invite me to dinners and laugh with me without expectation. It feels good to be seen as a person, not a burden. Last spring, I finally took that trip to Europe Robert always wanted me to have. I walked through quiet streets in Ireland, stood on windy cliffs above the ocean, and felt the kind of peace I thought had passed me by. It was everything we'd dreamed of, and I carried him with me every step of the way. In the living room, there's a framed article on the wall. Texas woman wins $8 million in elder abuse settlement. I don't keep it there to gloat. I keep it to remind myself how far I've come. When I sit on my porch in the evenings watching the sun sink below the hills, I feel something I never thought I'd feel again. Whole. I am no longer a woman living in someone else's shadow. I am my own person, living with dignity, with strength, and with a quiet pride in the woman I've become. I sit here tonight on my porch, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and lavender as the sun dips behind the hills. The quiet hum of crickets fills the air, and I wrap my hands around a warm mug, feeling the calm settle deep in my bones. This little ranch has given me more than just a home. It's given me my dignity back. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, about the choices I made and the ones Brian made. For a long time, I thought love meant forgiveness, no matter what that a mother's job was to endure in silence. But I've learned something else now. Sometimes love means teaching your children that choices have consequences even when it breaks your heart to do it. It wasn't easy to stand up to him, to watch him fall, and not rush in to catch him. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering if I'd done the right thing. But I know now that I did. Because loving someone doesn't mean letting them walk all over you. Loving yourself means knowing you deserve better. So I want to ask you, sitting there listening to my story, what would you have done if you were me? Have you ever felt betrayed by the people you loved most? Did you find the strength to stand up, or are you still carrying that hurt? I'd love to hear your story. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you've learned on your journey. As the stars come out and the air grows cool, I feel a quiet kind of pride settle over me. The kind that comes from surviving, from healing, from finally knowing my worth. This is not the end of my story. In some ways, it's just the beginning. Thank you for staying with me through it. You'll find a few more stories waiting for you on the screen now, and I promise they'll surprise you just as much as this one.